One of the problems with living in isolated parts of any state back in the days of the 20s and 30s was the fact that the roads were unpaved and unimproved. In 1933, the bulk of the highways and roads in Pennsylvania were unpaved. And in 1933, a man by the name of Gifford Pinchot was elected governor. And he was a well-known naturalist and politician. But he committed to getting the farmer out of the mud. That was his mantra to get elected, and he was elected. But he couldn't do the whole state in properly wide roads or to top quality. There was just not enough money to do that. So what he started out to do was just to make the blacktops wide enough for one car, 10 feet. That gave the one-way traffic capability, and of course when you made a car, you both had to move off to the side on the berm a little, but at least for the bulk of the time you could be on paved roads. These roads became known as Pinchot roads, and they were famous for solving the problem, although it took most of the decade to do it. There was a mile or two paved directly inside of Frenchville, as well as a couple of other villages between Frenchville and Clearfield. I remember that the blacktop ended at the eastern edge of Frenchville, right next to the edge of the cemetery. I remember seeing a team of horses pulling a wagon in front of us through the mud, and those horses realized that there was blacktop and smooth going ahead, and when they saw it, they started to try to gallop, and they really speeded up, and when they got on top of the blacktop, they were happy horses. The road from Frenchville on in both directions was eventually paved, but the road from our house to that road, which was about a mile and a half or 2 miles, something of that nature, has never been paved to this day. It has been improved by dumping shale and rock over the mud. When the ruts were frozen, the car would be knocked sideways back and forth as the tires encountered the sides of the rut, and the bottom of the car would scrape along on the dirt between the ruts because the car would sink down to the bottom of the floorboards, and it was very difficult going. It was really hard on the car because it had to do it in low gear, and it took a lot of stress and strain to move it. When we were finally successful in reaching the beginning of the blacktop of the highway, and the car sped up, the mud flying from the wheels against the underside of the fenders made a loud metallic noise, and of course we carried mud as well as other traffic well onto the blacktop. Probably for half a mile or more, the blacktop was covered with mud. Of course, this mud raised havoc with the mechanical parts of the car. The wheel bearings and everything underneath were just coated with mud. These two pictures show chains being installed on rear tires. This was a common occurrence, and I've done it personally many times, but without the chains, in many cases, the cars would have stayed there until hell froze over. And of course, in the summer, the dust would enter into the motor and the other mechanical parts and do substantial damage. So car maintenance and car life was very severely impacted. It was particularly bad when the seasons were wet, fall, winter, and spring, basically. The roads were ugly, to say the least. I remember when I was in grade school, when I was doing the barn chores, one of the things I had to do, especially when the weather was bad and the cows weren't put out to pasture, I had to lead the cows down to the spring below the house from the stables. And this was it was a fair walk. Maybe it took 5 minutes or perhaps a little more to lead the cow down there. Of course, I had to wait till she drank and then take her back up to the barn. This one morning, the cow was in heat, and I could see she was acting rambunctious and not docile as she normally was. Cows are very docile animals, and except when they go in to eat, and then they get uh, unpredictable. Nevertheless, I was walking. We left the barnyard and going down the slope to the spring. We had to cross the road to get to the spring, and when we got to the road, she began to pull and try to run toward Wenatchee's, which was heading south up the hill. Well, there was a lot of snow on the ground, and the roads had been traveled on, and the snow was packed on the road. There wasn't any dirt or mud visible. I was leading her with a 15, 20-foot long chain that we had for that purpose. She turned and started to gallop toward Wenatchee's and going up the hill, and it wasn't long before I tripped and fell, but I decided to hang on to her because I was afraid that she would run away and get into the river hills, and I would never be able to find her. So I hung on, and I don't know how old I was, maybe, well, I suspect Dad was in CC camps then. Maybe I was 6 or 7 years old, something of that nature. Otherwise, Dad would have taken those cows down to the spring. Anyway, she started to run, wide open, and crazy. She had her tail up in the air, and she was dropping cow pods, and I could see them dropping, and I'd make a quick roll to the side to avoid them. And I did really well with that. She didn't drag me through one of them, but boy, it was a long drag. We got to Wenatchee's, which is probably, half, 3/4 of a mile, something like that. And she made a right turn, headed down toward the river, down the hill past the retreat place, Bethany retreat place now, but it was Wheeler's then. But anyway, somebody at Wenatchee saw me being dragged along the road, and they started to chase us, and it took them a little while to get caught up. I guess I was probably down past Wheeler's before somebody finally caught up to her and got her by the nose and stopped her. I lost a button or two off of my heavy coat, and otherwise I wasn't hurt. But the Wenatchees were all very concerned that I'd been badly injured. But I'll never forget that. That was quite a ride. The Daily Mail was a day late. Dad always subscribed to Clearfield Progress, and it was a daily event that we all looked forward to. For me, there was the comics, which I always enjoyed, and I want to include a few samples of what the comics were back in the 20s and 30s and into the war. These few here are pretty good examples, especially the single panel Out Our Way, or Born 30 Years Too Soon. I still find amusement looking at the sites on the internet that include copies of hundreds of these. On closer examination, I just noticed that the whole incident arose from the fact that the girl's pigtail has been dipped in his ink bottle. Each desk had an ink bottle, and that's the whole issue there. You can see the ink splotches on her blouse there and on his desktop, and he got caught at it, and the end of her pigtail is black. And a precisely exact incident where my cousin Vernon was sitting next with me on the same seat, and this red-headed girl was sitting in front of us with exactly the same kind of pigtail. And I think she probably looked like this little girl too. She wasn't very pretty, I remember. And we got into deep doo-doo there. Teacher was a big woman and young and strong, big old German farm girl. And she reached over and got us each a hair on the top of our head and lifted us right out of our seat. that girl and her brother only came to school for 1 year, and I don't know where they came from or where they went, and I don't know anything about them, but they had peculiar habits, both of them. The girl's peculiar habit was on Monday she would show up with 4 or 5 dresses on, one on top of the other, wearing them, and then each day she'd take one off. So she had a different outer dress on each day, and by Friday she was down to one dress. Well, that's the truth. It's really a weird story, but there were a lot of weird things going on in those days. Well, these are cartoons made by a wonderful artist and man during the 20s and 30s. They really do represent the ugly truth of the times of the Depression. As I've installed these into this video, brought back a lot of memories, and they do really reflect the lifestyle in those days. Certainly the experiences with barefootedness during the summer clearly relate to my own difficulties in putting shoes back on in the fall, time for school. And some of the incidences in the school too. Certainly the depiction of the schoolroom and kids in the schoolroom are true to my memories. It's it's really incredible how the cartoonist has picked up on the actual events that I personally have experienced and made them funny and yet historical. As I mentioned earlier, the Clearfield Progress was our newspaper, and even though it was a day late, it always was an interest to me, and I always read it from front to back. Of course, during the war, it always had war news, and uh, generally the newspaper was occupied by news of events overseas. And on the left-hand column, on the front page, were the names of the soldiers and others involved who were either killed in action, missing in action, or otherwise had newsworthy events happening to them. Of course, this was always the first thing we all looked at to see if there was anyone on that list that we knew. And rarely a day passed where some name on there wasn't either intimately familiar or vaguely known. It was always a source of concern. But I enjoyed reading the paper, especially the comics. One was Alley-Oop, which was prehistoric people who had tamed dinosaurs and rode them around and had wars and stuff. It was crazy. And then there was one by the name of George Bungle. He was a guy who was always in trouble. And Red Ryder, that was a Western. And I remember when I was little reading Red Ryder, he was on his horse and he was escaping from some gunfight or something, and a shot rang out and Red Ryder reeled in the saddle. And I didn't know what that meant. I asked Mom what reeled meant, and she said, well, he almost fell off of his horse. He had been wounded by a bullet. I remember all that after 85 years. But anyway, and then there were a couple others, a couple of single panel comics. One was Out Our Way, and it depicted a old time machine shop and the foreman was always a big guy with a big gut and a cigar in his mouth, and so, not too bright, but he was the King Tut. It was interesting. I enjoyed it. Then there was one by the name of Hoop, and he was a non-productive, overweight guy who thought he was pretty important. Not royalty, but he certainly was above work, and whereas his wife was the hard-working mistress of a boarding house. it's ironic that I actually, my first boarding house in Erie when I left home to go to work at GE, really pretty well duplicated that situation where this bumbling, lazy, overfed husband was the leech on the family there, and the woman worked her can off to do the cooking and so forth for the boarders. And I'll get into boarders later, but anyway. But the newspaper was printed on the day before, and by the time it was delivered to Frenchville and then distributed by the local mailman, it was always a day late. The newspaper printed news that was yesterday's news, but of course, as far as we were concerned, it was current stuff. A few times, and I don't know what prompted Mom and Dad to do this, but we would make homemade ice cream. We had a hand-turned ice cream mixer. Mom made the ingredients. She made kind of a vanilla pudding mixture. She poured it in a stainless steel container, and inside the container were paddles, and there was a mechanism to turn a crank which turned the paddles. We had to pack ice around this steel container and sprinkle salt on the ice in order to drop its temperature. It took a while to do it. Sometimes it took perhaps a half hour, an hour of cranking before it would freeze and make ice cream. But it was always a delicious treat. Of course, we had to do it in the wintertime when ice was available, because we didn't have a refrigerator. Before 1900, the only communications was the mail system that had been established by the government, as I recall, around 1880s or maybe before that. But the system required that the receiver pay the postage. And so with the shortage of money and the poverty and all that associated concerns and sparsity of post offices, much of the mail accumulated at the post office near its destination and was not claimed. But after 1900, the railroad and the telegraph system that associated with it became a prime source for rapid communications. And then Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and gradually that spread. So then in Frenchville, around 1932, a private telephone system was set up by a family in Frenchville by the name of Sayers. This was sort of a community telephone. It had a telephone line to groups of houses, but those lines were connected. So when the telephone rang in one house, it rang in all the houses connected to that particular wire. And then the receiver would know that it was for him by the number of rings that the bell made. And of course, when the phone rang, all the people on that party line, as they called it, picked up and listened. But when the telephone rang, and if it rang, say, 3 shorts and a long, and that was your signal, then of course you knew the call was for you. That was done by Mrs. Sayers, who had a switchboard in her living room, and when an incoming call came from an outside telephone system, such as the Bell system, she would then switch to the line that you were on, and then press a button the appropriate number of times. And that worked reasonably well. I remember when Uncle Charlie got his, and it's kind of comical to see everybody run like crazy to the telephone whenever it rang, whether it was for them or not. And they'd pick it up and listen to the private conversation of the recipient and whoever was calling. In 1932, my Aunt Helen was married and lived in Orlando, and they were living in Uncle Lawrence's emergency messages. The one delivered to the mail carrier built in. You'd have to wait until the next delivery day. Uncle Lawrence's message came in after he left the post office in the morning. The place was vacant. So Klein was her name. And they apparently didn't get along, or something. Apparently wasn't a happy marriage. And I gather this from rumors and also from a letter that she wrote to my dad sometime prior to the time I'm referring to here from Orlando, and wanted to come back to Frenchville, but there wasn't any place for her to live. Anyway, apparently Aunt Helen had used Uncle Lawrence as her contact, because in 1932, Uncle Lawrence, who was a telegraph operator on the Pennsylvania Railroad in the Cinemahoning branch, had a phone there where he worked, and he called Mrs. Sayers. It says, "Lawrence Ruggie told us to let you know that Helen Ruggie was poisoned from mushrooms, and the doctor said she had 1 chance in 1,000 to get well. She is at Winter Park," which is near where they lived there, near Orlando. He wants you to go down to Deer, which was a telegraph office near Frenchville, but on the New York Central line. This request implied that Dad was to use the only means of contacting his brother was over the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad telephone system. And the message said for Dad to go down to Deer and call his brother, Uncle Lawrence, at CT, which was a central transfer point between the Pennsylvania and New York Central. And he wanted Dad to do that this afternoon. And apparently, I see here in the note that the mail carrier would have been Claire Mignot delivered the message next day to Dad at home because Dad wasn't working then. Mushrooms were part of the food chain Frenchville, and when they went to Florida, her and her husband, she found mushrooms that apparently she thought looked like the one in Frenchville and were safe. There are many varieties of mushrooms, and few of them are safe for humans to eat. And she misidentified mushrooms she picked down there at Orlando, and apparently ate them, and she died a short time later. There was a lot of suspicion about her death. She apparently was very ill and then recovered, but then relapsed and died. And I remember Mom and somebody talking there in front of the church after Mass one morning, and there was a rumor going around that her throat had been bruised by apparent thumbprints and that her husband had killed her. But he disappeared and no one ever knew or heard from him again. This story I'm about to tell you happened in 1938 and created quite a large amount of interest in the region of central Pennsylvania, particularly the West Branch of the Susquehanna River where these events happened. That region originally was covered with huge forests of mammoth pines and oak and other trees. And the original settlers came there, including my great-grandfather and grandfather, who was born on the water on the way over here in 1835. But they, along with thousands of other settlers and businesses, cleared the timber during the late years of the 19th century and a little bit into the 20th. During this time, sawmills were located about 100 miles or so down the river at Williamsport and further on toward the Chesapeake Bay on the main branch of the Susquehanna River. In order to market these trees, they were cut down and hewn square and lashed together and floated down the river during the spring freshets. Both my great-grandfather and grandfather floated hundreds of rafts, 100 miles or so more, actually a little more, down the river to Williamsport to the sawmills. This practice pretty well ended by the end of the 19th century for a couple of reasons. The trees were basically cut and numerous sawmills had been erected in the area so that the logs could be processed on site rather than this really treacherous and dangerous journey down that river. And of course they had to walk back 100 miles or more to their home. I have no data on how many men were lost on that raging river during the spring freshets, but there certainly had to be drownings due to accidents and falling overboard and so forth. By the 1930s, anybody that had an actual experience in rafting was getting to be an old man. West of Clearfield, there's the headwaters of the West Branch of the Susquehanna, Cherry Tree, and near Cherry Tree is another little town called Burnside. There were a number of old guys there that had been rafters, and for sentimental reasons, they decided to make the last raft, they called it, one more raft. So during the year preceding 1938, they went into the woods and cut trees and hewed them square, and I have a few pictures here showing some of these old guys doing this manual labor on these logs. But they fashioned together a raft about 120 feet by roughly 40 feet wide. On March 15th, 1938, the ice had cleared and the river was still high, and it was launch time. So they launched it from Burnside, and in the morning of March 15th. There were about 20 people on board, and they floated on down to Clearfield, which is about 10 to 15 miles, and tied up at Clearfield and stayed overnight that first day. On the second day, they had planned to tie up at Carthus, which is where we were going to watch it. The whole countryside was aware of the schedule, and was there at least 4,000 people in Clearfield that stood along the banks or not along the town and watched the raft go by. It was scheduled to arrive down at Carthus, about 20 miles down the river, around noon on the 16th. So my dad and mother and sister and I went down there early, plenty early. We didn't want to miss it because the schedule wasn't fixed in stone, that's for sure. So we stood down on the bank of the river on this cloudy, cold, rainy day. Thoroughly miserable day, I remember. And we waited there for a number of hours, watching up the river. There was a long sweeping curve in the river, and of course all eyes were fixed on that. And eventually we saw a dot, a little spot in the middle of the river coming, and of course everybody shouted, and it's coming, he's coming. And so, as I said, they were scheduled to stop at Carthus. The oarsmen, steermen, or whatever he was called, there were several men on this long tiller pole, tried to steer the raft close to the edge of the river, where another man with a heavy rope was going to try to lasso a rock that had been used during the quite a few years of rafting as a stopping place. And Carthus had a hotel right across the railroad tracks from this rock, so it made a convenient spot to stop overnight. You know, they couldn't run the raft at night. It was too dangerous. The river winds like serpentine fashion through the mountains, so they need all the vision and precaution they can possibly get in order to make the trip. So they had to stop there, or stop along the river at night. The water was running swiftly, and had a lot of debris and trees and so forth in it. The ice had broken up a few weeks before, March 6th, I believe was the date, and it had been about 24 inches thick, so the ice was a substantial hazard and had to be gone before they started. But the water was very cold and muddy and swiftly flowing. It looked dangerous to me. We stood along on the bank of the river, and just a couple of feet below our feet was the edge of the water, swiftly flowing. And as the raft approached the bank, just about where we were standing, I instinctively knew that there was no way they were going to stop that swiftly moving raft with that rope. I think that they would have torn the raft apart if they'd have been able to snag that rock because of the speed of the raft and the momentum that required to stop it against that current. And the raft was barely above water. I noticed that the people standing on the raft, the bottom of their feet were sometimes covered with water. And I noticed a couple of women standing near the little shed that was built in the middle of it, and their feet were wet. I could see the water lapping around their open shoes. They didn't even have boots on or rubbers. And I could see from their posture and the way they were standing that they were really cold, because I saw in the paper the next day that the raft had taken a dip over one of the dams up near Clearfield and pretty well soaked a lot of the passengers. And there were about 20 or 30 people on this raft, so there were quite a few. And I remember on the side of the little shed, they had a Coca-Cola sign nailed to it. The sign was probably 4 or 5 feet long by 3 feet wide. I remember that Coke sign for some reason or other, and I had not thought about it until I was looking at some pictures that I picked up on the internet here, and sure enough, there's that Coke sign on the side of the shed. Although in the picture the Coke sign is backward because they exposed the film from the backside rather than the front, so the sign is reversed. But it's definitely Coca-Cola. I'm a little surprised. I remembered seeing that sign there. Anyway, they didn't stop. They couldn't stop, so they went on down the river out of sight. They managed to stop at Renova, which is another 10 or 15 miles down the river, and apparently there was a calmer place where they could move into and get out of that current and stop the raft. So they stopped the raft every day, as I said. So by the 21st, they had reached pretty much their destination. They were within a mile of their destination at Williamsport. Actually, Muncie, which is a little town near Williamsport, is where the sawmill was. And the sawmill had already paid for the raft, for the logs. They had bought the logs, so the termination of the trip was at Muncie. And they were within sight of the sawmill, and there was a bridge there that, there's a lot of controversy. Somehow they managed to hit the pier of the bridge, and the raft, they termed it saddlebagged around the pier, and all but two were of the 45 that were on their raft at that time were knocked into the water, and 7 of them drowned. They never did find one of the victims. Apparently he floated on down the river into the Chesapeake and out into the Atlantic, but it ended up in a terrible tragedy. It certainly was the last time that anything like that was tried. Well, I think I'll end this one here and we'll go to the next video now.